Have you ever wondered what the Bible really says about the most severe sexual sins? In a world where ideas about morality are constantly changing, the Bible's teachings on sexuality remain a powerful point of reference for many people. But did you know that some actions which are often seen as acceptable in today's culture were once considered not only immoral but horrifically sinful, according to biblical texts? Today, we will explore the 4 most terrible sexual sins in the Bible. Sins that were not just frowned upon but considered grave offenses, deserving of severe punishment. And these are not just ancient rules, they have consequences that echo into our modern lives. Are we aware of what these sins really mean? Let's take a deep dive and find out. Before we dive into today's thought-provoking topic, I want to welcome back all my returning subscribers. Thank you for your time. And if you're new, I'm so glad you're here. Please kindly hit the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a video. And if you're watching right now, I'd love to know where you're tuning in from. Drop a comment below with your location. In order to understand why certain sexual sins are called out as so grievous in the Bible, we need to first examine the broader context of sexual morality within biblical teachings. From the very beginning, sexuality has been a fundamental part of God's design for humanity. The creation story in Genesis 1 and 2 reveals that God made man and woman, creating them to be partners, to be one flesh, and to multiply and fill the earth. But this was never meant to be a license for sexual behavior without boundaries. The Bible consistently emphasizes that sexuality is a sacred gift, intended to be enjoyed within the covenant of marriage. When sexual actions stray from this boundary, they are not merely personal or social wrongdoings. They are violations of God's divine order. But what makes these sins so terrible in God's eyes? Throughout both the Old and New Testaments, we see that sexual immorality is not only viewed as sin, but also as something that damages the person, the community, and even the relationship with God. In fact, certain sexual sins are outlined with such severity because they were seen as undermining the fabric of society, leading to spiritual corruption and societal decay. The 4 most terrible sexual sins in the Bible. Adultery, a term that resonates with betrayal, deception, and broken trust. But in the Bible, it's much more than that. Adultery is considered one of the most serious violations of marital vows and is condemned throughout both the Old and New Testaments. Let's take a closer look at why adultery was considered such a grave sin. The 10 Commandments, found in Exodus 20:14, explicitly forbid adultery. You shall not commit adultery. But it wasn't just about the act itself. Adultery symbolized a break in the covenant, both the earthly covenant between husband and wife and the spiritual covenant between God and his people. Jesus even expanded on this teaching in Matthew 5 verse 27 to 28, saying that lusting after someone in your heart is the same as committing adultery. Why was adultery so significant in biblical terms? In the ancient world, marriage was seen as a foundational institution for family life and social stability. Adultery not only broke personal trust, but also disrupted the social order. It was considered a betrayal of the sanctity of marriage and a disrespect for the divine order established by God. But beyond the relationship, adultery was also a sin that carried deep spiritual implications. In the Old Testament, the act of adultery was associated with idolatry. Cheating on one's spouse was akin to cheating on God. This parallel is drawn in the book of Hosea, where Israel is likened to an unfaithful wife who abandons her husband for false gods. The Bible also warns that adulterers would face divine judgment and even death in certain situations, as in the case of the woman caught in adultery in John 8:3-11. Adultery is serious because it destroys relationships, causes deep emotional harm, and dishonors both the partner and God himself. It's a violation of trust, purity, and the sacredness of marriage. Fornication, premarital sex. A term often misunderstood, it refers to sexual relations between unmarried people. The Bible consistently condemns premarital sex as a violation of God's commandment regarding sexual purity. In the New Testament, the Apostle Paul speaks explicitly about sexual immorality in books like 1 Corinthians 6:18, where he advises believers to flee from fornication, saying, "Every other sin a person commits is outside the body, but the sexually immoral person sins against his own body." This idea of sinning against the body underscores how serious fornication is. It's not just a sin against another person, but a violation of one's own physical and spiritual well-being. In the book of Hebrews, marriage is described as honorable, and the marriage bed is to be kept pure. Hebrews 13:4. Premarital sex, in this light, is seen as a corruption of the sacred space that should be reserved for marriage. Why is fornication so destructive? It's not just about the physical act, but about the broader spiritual consequences. It leads to disobedience, emotional harm, and a disconnect from God's ideal for human sexuality. Incest refers to sexual relations between family members, specifically those within prohibited degrees of kinship. In the Old Testament, incest was strictly forbidden, and laws around this were codified in Leviticus 18:6-18. This was not just a social taboo, but a direct command from God. Incest was seen as deeply corrupting, and engaging in it was believed to defile both the individuals involved and the entire family unit. Why is incest such a terrible sin? First and foremost, it's a violation of God's design for the family. Families were meant to reflect harmony and unity, not division and chaos. Engaging in incestuous relationships was seen as an act that desecrated that unity, breaking down the family structure and exposing individuals to profound emotional and spiritual harm. There are also health risks related to incest, which might have been understood in a rudimentary way by ancient societies. Incest can lead to genetic disorders and negatively affect the health of offspring. Beyond the physical, however, the spiritual ramifications are far more significant in the biblical context, where it was seen as an abomination before God. Homosexuality has been a contentious issue in both ancient and modern discussions about sexuality. In the Bible, homosexuality is condemned in several passages, including Leviticus 18:2 and Romans 1:26-27. These verses outline that same-sex sexual acts are contrary to God's natural design and are seen as morally and spiritually corrupt. In the Old Testament, homosexual acts were seen as a direct violation of the order God established when creating man and woman. In the New Testament, the Apostle Paul reaffirms this position, warning that those who engage in same-sex sexual activity are involved in practices that lead to spiritual death. Homosexuality in this light is seen as a distortion of God's original design for human sexuality, leading to spiritual separation from God. What makes homosexuality such a terrible sin, biblically speaking? It goes beyond just the act itself. Homosexuality, in biblical terms, represents a rejection of God's intended order for creation. It's viewed not merely as a personal choice, but as a rebellion against God's design, with profound consequences on both the individual and the broader community. The impact of these sins on modern life. Now that we've explored what the Bible says about the most severe sexual sins and the historical and cultural context in which they were written, we need to take a step back and ask, what do these ancient teachings mean for us today? Are the sins of adultery, fornication, incest, and bestiality still as relevant in our modern world? Or have our cultural norms shifted so far that these teachings no longer hold the same weight? To understand their impact on modern life, we have to look at how these biblical teachings continue to shape Christian doctrine, influence conversations around morality, marriage, and sexuality, and, perhaps most importantly, how they challenge us to think about our own lives and the world around us. In many Christian communities today, the Bible's teachings on sexual sin remain at the forefront of moral discussions. From Sunday sermons to Bible study groups, pastors and leaders often refer to the Bible's stance on sexual morality as the bedrock of their ethical teachings. But how does this apply in a world that has changed dramatically since the time these scriptures were written? The first question we must ask is whether the Bible's stance on sexual ethics is still universally accepted within the church. The reality is, there is a spectrum of belief among Christians about the application of biblical sexual ethics. For many conservative and traditional Christians, the Bible's teachings on adultery, fornication, and other sexual sins are non-negotiable. These teachings form the foundation of their views on marriage and relationships. Adultery is seen not only as a betrayal of the marriage covenant, but as a direct affront to God's plan for human relationships. Fornication is also seen as a moral violation, with a firm belief in abstinence until marriage being upheld as the ideal. However, for other Christians, the interpretation of biblical sexual ethics is more flexible. In some progressive and liberal circles, there's an understanding that the context of these scriptures may have been specific to the ancient world, and not necessarily applicable to the modern day. For example, the concept of marriage during biblical times was vastly different from today's understanding of a loving, consensual partnership. For these Christians, the central theme of love, respect, and mutual consent is often prioritized over the strict adherence to prohibitions. Beyond the church, the impact of these teachings can also be seen in the broader culture. The sexual revolution of the 20th century, particularly the 1960s, drastically reshaped societal views on sex, marriage, and morality. Premarital sex, once condemned in most Christian denominations, became increasingly normalized, and by the 21st century, attitudes toward sexuality had become far more liberal. The rise of online dating, the normalization of divorce, and the widespread acceptance of same-sex relationships have all shifted the cultural landscape in ways that would have been unimaginable to the authors of the Bible. In many Western societies, the boundaries of what constitutes sexual sin have blurred significantly. This raises a significant question. Are the moral teachings of the Bible regarding sex still relevant, or are they outdated? For instance, while adultery and fornication may still be seen as serious sins by some, in other parts of the world, they are often met with a more accepting or indifferent attitude. The rise of hookup culture and an increasingly secular society has left many questioning the validity of biblical teachings on sexual morality. One of the most striking shifts in contemporary culture is the growing acceptance of LGBTQ+ rights, including same-sex marriage. In contrast to biblical teachings that traditionally condemned same-sex sexual relationships, many modern Christians are rethinking the Bible's stance on LGBTQ+ issues. For some, the Bible's teachings are seen as outdated and in need of reinterpretation in light of new understandings of human sexuality. For others, these teachings remain a core part of their faith and identity, leading to tension within both religious and secular communities. Given the cultural shifts, how does the modern church address the sexual sins described in the Bible? Many pastors and religious leaders find themselves at a crossroads, grappling with how to speak to their congregations about sex in a world that is so different from the one in which the scriptures were written. For some, the solution lies in returning to a more conservative interpretation of biblical morality, emphasizing the importance of chastity, marital fidelity, and abstaining from sexual relations outside of marriage. For others, there's a call for a more compassionate and nuanced approach, one that takes into account the complexity of modern relationships and the changing definitions of what it means to be human. The church, in many ways, has become a battleground for these differing views on sexuality. While the Bible may offer spiritual teachings about sexual sins, there are also significant psychological and social implications to consider. Adultery, fornication, incest, and other sexual offenses can have profound effects on individuals and communities. For instance, adultery often leads to broken relationships, fractured families, and a loss of trust, both within the family unit and the broader community. The emotional and psychological damage caused by infidelity can be long-lasting, affecting not only the partners involved, but also children and extended family members. The effects of premarital sex and casual relationships are also important to consider. While some argue that sex outside of marriage is a personal choice that does not necessarily harm anyone, others contend that it can contribute to emotional instability and confusion, particularly for those who engage in sex without considering the long-term consequences. In many cases, unprotected sex outside of committed relationships can lead to sexually transmitted diseases, STDs, unintended pregnancies, and other health issues. Furthermore, incest, the sexual relationships between close family members, remains one of the most taboo subjects in modern society, both from a moral and legal perspective. While the Bible condemns incest, e.g., Leviticus 18 verse 6 to 18, this sin is also illegal in most countries due to the potential harm it can cause in terms of genetic defects and the psychological trauma it can inflict on individuals. Bestiality, though less commonly discussed in contemporary society, also remains a deeply disturbing act in biblical teachings and is generally condemned by modern laws around the world. The act itself raises significant ethical concerns regarding the treatment of animals and the violation of the natural order. In a postmodern world where moral relativism is more widespread and religious faith is often seen as a personal matter, the relevance of biblical sexual ethics is frequently questioned. Yet, despite these cultural shifts, many people still find solace and guidance in the Bible's teachings. For those who hold to a traditional Christian worldview, these scriptures provide a timeless moral framework, one that offers clarity and direction in an increasingly uncertain world. At the same time, the rise of secularism and the decline of organized religion in many parts of the world have led some to question whether the Bible's teachings on sexual sin should still hold any sway over our lives. With the growing influence of science, psychology, and individualism, the old moral codes seem less and less applicable to the realities of modern life. As we come to the end of this exploration, it's clear that the Bible's teachings on sexual morality have had a profound influence on shaping Western ideas of right and wrong. The 4 sexual sins we've examined, adultery, fornication, incest, and bestiality, continue to be viewed by many as deeply immoral and harmful to individuals, families, and communities. Whether or not these sins are considered as severe today as they were in biblical times is a matter of perspective. But the biblical framework offers a foundation for understanding human relationships and the consequences of sexual behavior. However, as we've seen, modern life complicates the application of these teachings. Cultural shifts, changes in the understanding of sexuality, and evolving attitudes toward marriage and relationships have led to differing interpretations of biblical sexual ethics. What was once a clear-cut moral issue for many is now seen as a nuanced topic, subject to personal interpretation and context. Ultimately, the question of whether these biblical teachings are still relevant today depends on one's worldview. For those who believe the Bible is the unchanging Word of God, these teachings remain an essential guide for living a righteous life. For others, these same teachings may seem antiquated and disconnected from the realities of modern life. But regardless of where one stands on the issue, it's clear that the Bible's influence on discussions about sexuality will continue to be felt for generations to come. The exploration of these biblical sexual sins forces us to grapple with difficult questions about morality, human nature, and the role of faith in shaping our behavior. Whether you agree with the Bible's stance on these issues or not, it's impossible to ignore the profound impact these teachings have had on shaping our understanding of right and wrong. In the end, the challenge is to consider how these ancient teachings can guide us as we navigate our own lives in a rapidly changing world. And perhaps most importantly, to ask ourselves, what kind of moral compass do we choose to follow? And how do we reconcile our own beliefs with the teachings that have been passed down through generations? Thank you for staying with us on this exploration of hidden truths and ancient wisdom. If you found this video insightful, please like, share, and comment below. Let us know where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe as we continue to uncover the mysteries of existence together.